So here we go. Let's cruise through some of these ideas, as you do have a formative to get to, so I'm going to try and keep this one pretty concise. Retrieval, as we are learning about it, is going to be pretty self-explanatory, because like this is what we know of when we are talking about like memory. This is how we're like actually articulating things. This is how we're actually like pulling ideas out of our brain and using them to answer test questions or refer to a story that happened to us in the past, like whatever. So retrieval is kind of like what we know of memory, and then we'll talk just briefly about forgetting. But we're going to start here with this little graphic again. Yesterday we talked about encoding and we talked about storage. We looked at all of these different kind of components of storage, and today we will be looking at the retrieval process, right? How do we get that light bulb? How do we remember things and pull those things out of our brains and actually remember them? And then the last piece of the puzzle we are going to talk about is forgetting, and why do we forget things? And it's really important to recognize that forgetting things happens, or like there's a failure that could occur with the encoding process, with the storage process, or with the retrieval process. So a failure at any of these kind of stages of memory could lead us to forget content or whatever it is we're trying to remember. So a little bit of review here. Obviously, this is pretty wordy. We referenced these ideas at the very beginning of yesterday's lecture: recall, recognition, relearning. These are the ways in which we are demonstrating our memory, right? From each of these kind of demonstrations, we know that our storage and recall capacity is virtually unlimited based on research that's been done. We also know that the capacity for recognition is greater than the capacity for recall, right? That's why oftentimes, this is kind of a blanket statement. Generally speaking, a multiple choice test can be easier than like a fill in the blank test, because you see the potential options. Now, obviously, there are like confounding variables, and like people second guess themselves on multiple choice tests and have like test anxiety and whatever. So that's like a very blanket statement. Don't come at me. But generally speaking, being able to recognize the answer versus recalling it and actually pulling that definition or term from your memory is easier, and we have a greater capacity for it. And then the last piece here, relearning. We know that this can highlight the memories are, even if, so relearning honestly is going to highlight that memories are there even if we can't recall forming them, right? Because we maybe forgot something, but when we go back and try to relearn it, it goes quicker, meaning like our brain has it somewhere. We can't recall that information. So just kind of an example as we're pertaining to relearning. I want you to think about like, what is this object? Can you tell? What is the object? Even though it's obscured by 6 layers of scribbles, some of you glanced on the first slide of this PowerPoint or this lecture. You may recognize what this is, right? Now, if I gave you a multiple choice potential, you would be far more likely to be able to say like that object is blank than if I'm asking you to recall it, right? Let's see real quick. Now, can you tell what it is? How about now? Now? Weird. Well, I don't know why that didn't. It was supposed to progress and ultimately show you just, it's a log, like it's a tree stump that's cut in half. And this was on the very first slide of this PowerPoint. So some of you maybe recognized like, that's weird, why is that there? And you realized what it was and you were able to recall that. Maybe some of you didn't recognize it. But if I were to have given you a multiple choice potential, it would have been a lot easier for you to reference what the object in fact was. So as we're looking kind of at the next piece of the puzzle, right, you have recognition, recall, and relearning, right? That's where we're at as it pertains to retrieval. We know that all of these are components of how we remember things, right? We can see in implicit memory, as well as our talent for recognizing faces that we don't consciously recall, we may not be aware of all that we have in our memory, right? Another sign of this subconscious memory is the demonstrated change in our ability to relearn material. If we can learn the material more easily the second time, we must have preserved some sort of that memory, right? Oh, hey, so looking at the relearning process, here you have a graph that shows basically that the more times somebody rehearses out loud, the less time somebody needs to relearn or rememorize the same letters on day 2, right? So this is just a research study that was done, and Ebbinghaus actually studied like the memorization of nonsense syllables, so THB, YOX, KVU, EHM, and so people learned them the first day, and it took them X amount of time to memorize them. Then the next day, it took them less time, and then the next day, it took them less time, proving that like the memory is still there, we just can't recall it, right? So some questions that this type of research poses, to think back and connect back to what we talked about yesterday. What type of processing was Ebbinghaus doing, right? What are we looking at here? This is an example, right, of effortful processing. Remember that term. The next question, what does this show us about the best way to memorize, right? We know repetition is useful. So when you're studying for a test or when you're studying for whatever it is you're studying for, right, the more often you do it, right, remember the spacing effect and the timing effect from yesterday, or the testing effect, right, those are all ways to help you better study, right? So there you have relearning. And it's also important, big picture, to recognize that retrieval cues are important to our ability to like pull information out of our brain. We know that memory involves a web of associated concepts, right? It's not just like a filing cabinet where you can like alphabetically say like how to ride a bike, like a Google search, and like your brain files that away. Like there's a bunch of different connections. Like when did I last ride a bike? What type of bike was it? What was the weather like? Where was I going, right? You have all these different memories that kind of compose or come together to help you remember how to do something like riding a bike, right? We know retrieval is challenging. We know that memory isn't stored in a way that it can be retrieved easily, alphabetically, like I was saying, like a Google search, but instead it's like a web of associations, right? So you see this image here, right? We have conceptual, we have contextual, and we have emotional kind of memories that all combine together to help us remember specific instances. So with that, there are a couple of retrieval cues that we're going to talk about here real quick, different types of memories as it pertains to our understanding. So first thing is priming. Priming triggers a thread of associations that bring us to a concept. Just as a spider feels movement in a web, the following and follows it to find the bug, right? Like so a little thing is like triggered in our brain, and that web, that constructed web in our brain of memory makes us think, okay, this is what I'm looking for, right? Our minds work by having no idea, and this maintains the flow of thought. So I want you to define the word bark in your head. What is the word bark? Most of you probably said like the outer layer of a tree. What if I did this, right? Now, what would you say the definition of the word bark is, right? The sound a dog makes, right? And so because I primed you with the image of the tree first and then the image of the dog, right, that triggered something in your brain that was like, oh, tree, bark, bark outside of a tree. It didn't make you think like, oh, tree bark is the sound a dog makes, right? That doesn't make sense. So priming is actually a really powerful tool, and it's been studied in pretty significant detail throughout psychology and throughout our understanding of what is memory. So one thing to note is that priming has been called the invisible memory because it affects us unconsciously. If you remember back, we talked a little bit about like illusions, and we talked about like, oh no, what is it called? Oh my gosh. Subliminal messaging. Whoa, the light bulb. But when we're talking about like the case of the tree bark versus dog bark, the path we follow within our brain can be channeled by that priming. So they've done a bunch of studies, and one of the studies said that people primed with money-related words were less likely to help other people. So they would like prime them with a bunch of different money-related words, and then they'd like have somebody walk by and drop all their books, and the people who had the money-related words wouldn't help that person because it wasn't something that was going to achieve or get them like a monetary accolade of any sort, right? Whereas people who didn't get those money primers were willing to help because it was more about helping somebody and doing the right thing than it was about making money, right? They've also done studies that say that priming with an image of Santa Claus led kids to share more candy. So if they were shown a picture of Santa Claus versus somebody else, they would share more candy because Christmas is a time of giving for many children who practice Christianity. And even those who maybe don't and just know who Santa Claus is and kind of participate in maybe that cultural norm. Not everybody does, but those who do are seen to share more candy. And then the last one here, people primed with a missing child poster, then misinterpreted ambiguous adult-child interactions as kidnapping. So if they were shown like a missing person's picture versus just like a normal picture of a child, and then they saw like something going on between an adult and a child, they would think that was a kidnapping more quickly because their brain was primed to think that way. So these are just examples of priming, and it again ties back to our understanding of retrieval cues. How are we retrieving vocab? Define bark. How are we retrieving our interpretation of a situation? If it was a missing child, I might think this is a kidnapping, right? Priming is extremely powerful. And again, that invisible memory piece, it's unconscious. We don't necessarily know that it's happening. So with that idea of priming, we also have two types of memories that we're going to look at here. We have context-dependent memories and we have state-dependent memories. Context-dependent memories say that you're more likely to remember things in the same context that you learned them in. So if you're taught words underwater, you're more likely to remember those words when you're underwater. You can see this graph right here at how much more often people are able to like make those connections when they're in the context that they were in when they learned them. Oftentimes people say that context-dependent memory, like kids will want to sit in the same exact seat that they were in for the entirety of the class. I know like some teachers move people around in regards to like on test day, we're going to sit alphabetically so you're not by your friends or whatever. But kids sometimes want to sit in their same seat because of this context-dependent memory. If you learned it in that seat, you're more likely to remember it in that seat. We retrieve a memory more easily when in the same context as when we form the memory, right? So question, did you forget a psychology concept? Just sitting down and opening your book might bring the memory back, right? Not because you read it in the book, but because that's what you were doing when you learned it. Maybe you studied one of these units outside because it was nice out, and then you came inside to take the FRQ, right? And you couldn't remember certain things. Moving outside might jaunt your memory, okay? The second piece of this then is going to be state-dependent memories. So you see in this like kind of cartoon over here. I wonder if you'd mind giving me directions. I've never been sober in this part of town before, right? People, if they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol and they learn something, or they, in this example, right? Maybe they go to a bar in that area quite often, and so they know their way home from that bar when they've been drinking, but when they go there sober, they might forget their way because of this idea of state-dependent memory. Right? Our memories are not just linked to the external context, but also the emotional state we were in when we formed the memory, right? An even deeper kind of branch of a state-dependent memory is going to be a mood-congruent memory. This refers to the tendency to selectively recall details that are consistent with one's current mood, right? If you're angry, you're going to remember like negative things that maybe made you angry in the past, right? You're going to be more likely to remember those things than like if you're really happy, you might forget about all the icky things and you might remember the more positive things that have been going on, right? This biased memory then reinforces our current mood, right? We forget about the bad things, we continue to look at the good things, we continue to feel happy, right? So you have context-dependent and state-dependent memories. And then the last piece of these retrieval cues, and kind of our last kind of conversation about retrieval in and of itself, is the serial position effect. This has been studied a ton. We're actually going to watch just a brief video of an experiment that has been done to kind of reference the primacy effect. But basically this refers to the tendency that when learning information in a long list, we are more likely to recall the first items and the last items. That's why people say, like, if you're auditioning for a role on Broadway, it's better to go first or to go last, right? Because those are more memorable just in and of themselves. So when we look at this graph, you can see the blue line here, right? If you're called back like a certain amount of time after remembering a list of words, right, you're more likely to remember those first words, right? Whereas in this red line, right here, that immediate recall, you're more likely to remember the words that were said last, right? So if I say, okay, memorize this list of words, and I ask you right away, which ones do you remember? You're probably going to remember the last words. But if I call you back and I say, hey, this is like 15 minutes later, I'm like, hey, can you tell me what words you remember? You're more likely to then remember, again, these first few words here. So that's the serial position effect. Like I said, we're going to watch just a quick video about primacy effect, and then we're going to shift our attention to forgetting. So we have covered each of these, right? Encoding, storage, and retrieval. This is the stages of memory. And we are going to, again, watch that serial position effect, the primacy effect video, and then shift to our understanding of forgetting.
I'd like to know how to be more persuasive, let's say at getting a date or applying for a job. Well, we're about to recreate an experiment described by Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman in his fascinating book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
We've asked a few volunteers to play boss for the day and interview 2 candidates for the same job. Play along with our boss and decide which candidate you would hire. Listen carefully. The interviews will go by quickly. Here comes candidate number 1.
Hi.
Hello, I'm Stephanie.
Stephanie, Rico. Pleasure to meet you. Have a seat. Great. So how'd you hear about the company?
Through my school.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'm serious, hardworking, and creative. I'm also moody, nitpicky, and brutally honest.
Okay, that's candidate number 1. What do you think? Okay, now get ready for candidate number 2.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Stacy.
So, here's the key to the experiment. We're using identical twins with identical resumes, which eliminates all the variables except the candidate's own words. Listen closely to candidate number 2. You're gonna have to decide soon which one to hire.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'm brutally honest, nitpicky, and moody. But I'm also creative, hardworking, and serious.
Got it? Let's listen to the most important information one more time so you can make your decision.
I'm serious, hardworking, and creative. I'm also moody, nitpicky, and brutally honest. I'm brutally honest, nitpicky, and moody. But I'm also creative, hardworking, and serious.
So which one would you hire? 1 or 2? Let's see who the interviewer picks.
I would be more prone to go with the first candidate. The first one, my brain, it lit up. The second one had more like a negative vibe.
So, was number 1 your choice? In fact, 80% of the people we ran this experiment on hired applicant number 1.
I think I would go with Stephanie, which would be the first girl that I saw.
The first candidate,
I'd pick the first one.
she seemed to have a more positive outlook.
And there's a reason why.
In this case, the first information you hear stands out, and your brain uses that to color all later information. This is known as the primacy effect.
You probably noticed the girls are using the exact same words, only the order is different.
Serious, hardworking, creative, moody, nitpicky, brutally honest. Brutally honest, nitpicky, moody, creative, hardworking, serious.
And that order makes all the difference. Everybody knows you want to start with your best foot forward, but what's amazing is why. In situations like these, your brain actually starts to shut down after the first word or two. In an effort to take a shortcut, it quickly decides yes or no and doesn't pay much attention to the rest of the information. In test after test, the vast majority of people chose the applicant who started with positive words.
It's amazing that if you just change the order of adjectives, it can completely change the impression the person makes on you.
So there's that primacy effect. We are going to shift our attention to forgetting, and it's important to recognize that forgetting isn't always a bad thing. We referenced neural pruning. I can't remember if that was the bio unit or the developmental unit, but like over time our brain kind of prunes skills and memories and things, knowledge that like we don't need. So I gave the example of like I was in choir in high school. I took all of the music theory classes. I was very good at like sight reading music. And since I haven't done that a lot recently, my brain has kind of pruned that information because it's making way for new information. How do I be a good teacher? How do I engage with kids in e-learning, right? New things that I'm having to engage with. And so just recognize forgetting isn't always a bad thing.